Brandon Lawson left his San Angelo home late on a summer night, and within an hour, his truck sat deserted on a lonely Texas highway. He called his brother, telling him that there were people chasing him, that state troopers were running cars off the road, and finally he called 911, scared out of his mind and pleading for help. And then, Brandon just disappeared off the face of the earth. What followed was years of deception from police, an active attempt to discredit Brandon's character in the papers, and in the middle of it all was Brandon, a father who never came home to his wife and kids. There are three versions of events on the night of Brandon Lawson's disappearance. The first is the one the papers and the police pushed. The second comes from his brother, and the third is the truth. The truth that the public have been trying to figure out since 2013. So let's start with the version that the Observer Enterprise was so desperate to get out. Now, the Observer Enterprise isn't just a local paper that notifies the public of news around Coke County, Texas. It's owned by Melinda McCutcheon, the wife of Coke County Sheriff Wayne McCutcheon. According to them, the disappearance was pretty cut and dry. Brandon left home at around 11:55 on the night of August the 9th after a fight with his wife, LaDessa Lofton, about working late. He went from San Angelo to Fort Worth, a 4-hour drive on Highway 277, to spend time with his parents until everything could calm down at home. Shortly into his trip, he ran out of gas, so he called his brother Kyle Lawson to bring him some gas. At the same time, a 911 call came in from a passing motorist reporting a stranded car along the highway, so 2 officers were dispatched to take a look. Kyle arrived just as the officers were walking around the truck, but Brandon was nowhere to be seen. Kyle explained that his brother was in contact with him, but since reception wasn't all that great, the phone had cut out. He assured the officers that he'd find him along the highway and fill up his tank to make it to the nearest town, Brant, which was 30 miles up the road. The officers left, sure that everything would be all right. The Observer made the argument that Brandon was hiding in some bushes nearby and that Kyle was aware of this because Brandon had a warrant out for his arrest for possession with intent to deliver methamphetamine. The charge was a felony-level offense and carried a significant amount of jail time if he were found guilty. Kyle lied to the officers to get them off his brother's tail, but Brandon never appeared from the bushes after they left. Kyle would eventually report his brother as missing 4 days later. So when Brandon couldn't be found during the searches that took place in the days after the car ran out of gas, they were adamant that he'd simply fled the county because he was a sleazy druggie who didn't care about his wife and kids at home. Not only was this account completely false, littered with wildly inaccurate information, the paper's insistent reporting on it in the weeks that followed made it look like they were desperate to push a narrative that absolved the authorities of any wrongdoing. Just a few days after the disappearance, the Observer Enterprise opened a Facebook page. Before this case, the paper had no social media presence, but they got up and running in time to make their first post on Brandon and detailing this narrative. The family were beside themselves with fury. This wasn't at all what had happened, and Kyle Lawson sought out anyone and everyone who'd be willing to publish what really happened. Melinda McCutcheon then made posts from her private account, disparaging Brandon's character on the family's page that they'd set up. Help find Brandon Lawson. This was a hideous display of defamation to justify why police weren't doing a thing to find Brandon, or to explain why there was no forensic search of his car, no other searches to rule out foul play, and no interviews conducted with anyone other than Kyle, who reported him missing. So let's go over to Kyle's take on that night and clear up some of the Observer and police's lies, because the difference between the two of them is that Kyle actually had proof to back his statements up. But first, there's some background to take into account. Brandon was an addict, and he'd been for many years. The entire Lawson family were pretty experienced when it came to Brandon's behavior by then. They were extremely close-knit, and Brandon always put his family first. That is a fact that they were always very clear about. Recently, Brandon attempted to kick his habit for good. He made it 6 months without using at all. He had a good job and was even going to start a new job in a week that had better pay and less hours. His co-workers reported that Brandon was very hardworking and reliable. so much so that they couldn't believe he had any history with drug abuse at all. So Brandon was doing remarkably well in his recovery, on the outside at least. That warrant was completely bogus. Brandon was caught buying marijuana for a friend, so that technically was a case of intention to distribute. But excuse me if I'm not going to clutch at my pearls about a little wacky tobacco being shared between friends. Brandon posted bail and walked out of the county jail, certain that he'd get a fine or maybe a few months in jail if the judge was in a bad mood. So when he found out about the warrant for possession of distributing methamphetamine, he was confused about why it was such an extreme charge. Instead of handing himself over to the police, Brandon decided to save up some money to get a proper lawyer to overturn a charge that was clearly an overreaction or possibly a clerical error. This has been confirmed by arrest records and witness accounts of that charge. So yes, Brandon was avoiding the law, hoping to buy a little time to sort the matter out. Sadly, Brandon had relapsed just 2 days before his vanishing, a fact that Kyle and Ledessa were aware of. That night, Brandon did have a fight with Ledessa, and he was heading off to Fort Worth in his silver Ford F-150. There is a possibility that he was not heading to his parents' place. Fort Worth is also where Brandon's dealer lived, and Kyle thought that maybe they'd agreed to meet on the highway for the exchange of illegal substances. That highway's pretty desolate and wild, so it's definitely a possibility. When Brandon first called his brother, it was to tell him that the car had run out of gas. Kyle agreed to get a gas can and Brandon's credit card from Ledessa, make the 20-minute drive, and help his brother out. Kyle loaded his wife and young son into their car and went out at midnight. The drive took longer than expected because the car declined at the gas station, so Kyle fronted the money to fill up the tank. Throughout this trip, Kyle was on the phone with Brandon. The calls kept dropping off thanks to the terrible reception. Kyle went from perfectly coherent to, well, outrageous fear. Between calls dropping on and off, he claimed that there were people chasing him. He referred to them only as the Mexicans. Kyle asked Brandon if he was hallucinating, but Brandon was adamant. This was no crazy trip. He was being chased and he was bleeding. And quite frankly, Brandon couldn't have made it all the way to Fort Worth to buy drugs to get him into a state of psychosis in less than an hour since he'd left the house. Ledessa has always been firm that Brandon did not keep drugs in the house or the car. He had never, during all of his years of substance abuse, ever allowed the stuff near anywhere where his children could get into contact with it, nor did he use it if he was in their presence. And Kyle agreed. Why would Brandon, after a decade of consistency, suddenly veer off course now? It wasn't like the fight with his partner was outrageous or anything. They were just arguing about late hours. Brandon only had a week left on the oil field before starting his new job, and he didn't need to work so late. But he wanted to leave the job on good terms since he'd built up quite the reputation as a reliable and hard worker. These factors, and the fact that Kyle was experienced in Brandon's previous behaviorisms, made Kyle believe that his brother was being sincere. Then the call cut out, with Brandon calling back a few minutes later. This time, he said that there were stapers, possibly referring to state troopers, as is a common slang term in that area. He said that he was running in the bushes, that he could still see the road, and that these stapers had run the Mexicans off the road. The phone cut out again. This time, Brandon tried calling Ledessa, but she was already in bed, so she didn't answer. He tried phoning Kyle, but that call wouldn't go through until finally Kyle himself called 911.
911 emergency.
Yes, I'm in the middle of the field. The staper just pushed some guys over. Right here going towards Javelin on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. Got chasing to the woods. Please hurry.
Okay, now run that by me.
I'm not talking to him. I actually ran into him.
Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
That's the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance?
Yeah, no, I need the cops.
Okay. Is anybody hurt? Hello? Hello? Hello?
So the paper lied. No call came into 911 from a passing motorist as they claimed. To make matters worse, this call was never logged by the operator. She never sent any officers out to the scene at all. So why should the observer be so insistent on pushing that lie? We'll get back to that in a sec. Back to that call for now. Brandon was so terrified that he was willing to call for help from the police to save him. It's hard to make out, but Brandon confirmed that he'd run out of gas and he was correct about where his car was. So far, that's consistent with Kyle's account. Then Brandon mentioned that a staper just pushed some guys over, as he had done to Kyle just minutes before. Then he says that there are guys being chased into the woods. Brandon continued to say that he did not need an ambulance, but that he did need the cops. So it can be assumed that the injury that he mentioned to his brother wasn't life-threatening. Kyle found the car parked on this side of the road, pulled up, and made one more call to Brandon. Brandon told him that he could see Kyle's car from where he was. Kyle saw the oncoming patrol lights and told Brandon to stay put, that there were no cops coming. That's another inconsistency. The paper and police reported that the patrol officers were already at the scene when Kyle arrived. The officers did not inspect the vehicle, didn't check Kyle's ID, and they didn't bother to run Brandon's plates, or they would have seen that he had a warrant out for his arrest. Kyle assumed that they had just happened to pass by when they saw the truck stranded there. There was no traceable reason for them to be there at all. They just accepted Kyle's claim that he was here to fill up the car and that Brandon had attempted to walk to the nearest town, Bront. When the officers left and Kyle tried to call Brandon again, the phone went unanswered. If Brandon was so close that he could see Kyle, then Kyle should have at least heard the phone ringing, and he definitely should have heard his brother call out to him multiple times. Kyle continued to drive up and down that road for another hour before taking his wife and kids home so that they could get some sleep. Kyle was sure that Brandon was out there, but that he might be too afraid to come out. So he decided that searching by the early dawn light might be more effective. He then returned at 5 that morning. Unfortunately, the car, which now had enough gas in it to drive, was still exactly where it had been the night before, and Brandon's phone was now dead. The car was towed later that day, and for the next 4 days, Kyle stayed quiet, hoping that his brother would turn up. Only after half a week did he finally report Brandon as missing. Before you judge the man too harshly, he really thought that Brandon was laying low to hide from the cops. When Brandon said that he was bleeding, it clearly wasn't a serious wound. Most likely, he'd cut himself while stumbling out there in the dark, as proven by that 911 call. And no one wanted Kyle to go to jail for an issue that Brandon could contest. By day 4, Kyle had no choice but to report his brother missing. He came clean about everything, showed them the phone records, and didn't hide why he lied to the patrolman. This 4-day period of silence meant that police had lost critical time in their search. They focused on the immediate surrounding area. After all, Brandon had told his brother that he could see his car approaching. Sure enough, they found an indented spot in the brush where Brandon apparently sat down in. The place was hidden by bushes, but had a perfect line of sight to the road, exactly how Brandon had described it to his brother. But there was no sign of Brandon or any trace of where he'd gone to. Even if everyone believed that Brandon was tripping his marbles off and that there were no stapers or Mexicans chasing him, the rugged landscape still held an enormous amount of danger. The place is full of wild hogs, coyotes, bobcats, and mountain lions that would love to feast on a lone man. The Bront police realized pretty quickly that they were in over their heads after losing 4 whole days in the search, so they brought in the Texas Rangers to assist them. They brought out helicopters, sniffer dogs, and even thermal cameras. Seriously, if Brandon was anywhere close to where he last said he was, then they should have found him. Even if he had died due to an animal attack, his decomposing body would have released enough heat during the process to be picked up by the thermal cameras flying overhead. But there was nothing. The Texas Rangers came out with a statement that they believed that Brandon had fled the county, possibly by hitching a ride, because he was running from the arrest warrant. They and the Observer Enterprise made it seem like this case was cut and dry, just a druggie who ran from the police. So first they lied about the 911 call, then they lied about the circumstances of that evening to try and explain why there were two officers at the car even though no police were dispatched to the scene. Furthermore, there was no forensic observance of the abandoned car, nor was the ownership even run through the system after they towed it. This is all very odd. If they were running on the narrative that Brandon was out there hallucinating his eyeballs out of his head, then why not just stick to that and leave it be? If they'd done this, then no one, including the Lawson family, would have questioned it. But Melinda McCutcheon, probably with her sheriff husband behind her, went out of their way to put out post after post to hammer down their claim that a motorist made the 911 call, that those officers were dispatched to check in on the car, and they made posts from their personal accounts to put Brandon's character into question. Really disgusting comments about how Brandon didn't care about his family, insinuating that his addiction was more important than others' safety, and they deleted comments on their posts that questioned their take on the details, or those that criticized the police's lack of investigation. This goes beyond unprofessional. The McCutcheon's action screams desperation to cover something up. The fact that the sheriff's wife was actively putting out false information and going out of her way to silence questions about it, well, that's conspiracy theory fuel right there. And you can't exactly blame people for jumping to conclusions, now can you? We'll talk about the theories at the end. For now, Brandon Lawson's disappearance just hung around on the internet as a strange missing persons case for the next 9 years. The Lawson family and former classmates conducted searches every few months, slowly chipping away at the surrounding wilderness piece by piece, while Odessa kept the Facebook page alive and active throughout those 9 years. In January of 2022, a search set out again. They'd called a landowner nearby requesting to search his property for remains. Keep in mind, this property was only 2 miles away from where Brandon's truck had been all those years ago and was within the search parameters that the Texas Rangers searched back then. Yet no authority figure ever requested permission to search this property. That was literally within walking distance from the car. The owner of the land immediately gave the searchers permission with no limitations on where they could look. So there definitely wouldn't have been pushback from private owners back in 2013 either, because this man had owned the land back then too. Right inside the boundary of the property, just feet from the fence line, the searchers found Brandon's shorts and shoes, as well as a few scattered bones. They marked off the area and called it in, but police didn't arrive for a whole week because human remains apparently aren't super important to investigate out there. When I say that they didn't arrive for 1 week, I mean it. No one was even sent out to mark off the area until a forensic team could be sent out. They ran the DNA, not that there was much left after 9 years, out to the elements and the large amount of animal scavenging that the remains had endured. As expected, the results were inconclusive. All they could say for sure was that it was male and the clothes definitely matched what Brandon was wearing on the night he disappeared. So it's safe to assume that it was Brandon that they found. The family confirmed the findings as belonging to Brandon later that year. The body was in no state to give any cause of death, so authorities have put out a statement that he most likely died of exposure. Not that that means much. There are several injuries that could have caused Brandon's death that won't leave a mark after all those years at the mercy of the elements and the scavengers. And exposure makes no sense at all anyway. It was summer in Texas. Do you know how hot Texas gets in the summer? Nighttime temperatures are pretty freaking pleasant, but that's not exactly the ideal conditions to die of exposure, guys. Brandon's body was a mile away from the highway. He would have seen lights on the road throughout the night. He would have heard the cars passing by in the morning, and he definitely would have seen lights from houses on the private ranches around him. There are a dozen reasons why he should have walked out of there, even if you want to claim that he was under the influence of drugs. Unless he just sat down and waited to die for a few days, there's no reason he should have died there without injuries to his body. This is looking more and more like a dump site than an accidental grave. And now we get to the theories. because there's a whole lot wrong in the Brandon Lawson case, and the police's statements aren't cutting it for me. The majority of the sleuths and theorists agree that Kyle was telling the truth. Brandon had relapsed and was on his way to his dealer's place that night, but he didn't have enough time to actually make it there, so he was not under the influence and was not hallucinating. It's a 3-hour drive, but Brandon had run out of gas just 20 minutes after leaving his home. But what if Brandon really was on the road and that he'd run out of gas just like he said he had, and later when Kyle was already on his way to Brandon, Brandon just happened to have stopped at a place where an actual chase was underway. With a car barreling toward him, these Mexicans were fleeing from someone else, but Brandon assumed that they were chasing him, only for the state troopers that were in fact the ones chasing the Mexicans caught up, ran their target off the road, leaving Brandon to flee into the wilderness, utterly confused, terrified, and completely unaware of what on earth was going on. The very troopers that were involved in the case then doubled back to see what civilian's car they passed, to see if there were any witnesses. It was them that Kyle ran into when he stopped at the truck. When they learned that it was just a stranded motorist whose brother had come to fill up his tank, they left to continue the chase or to clean up evidence that it had ever occurred. Since the signal was bad, Brandon remained in his position for a while, giving the troopers or the people they were chasing the opportunity to find Brandon, kill him, and dump his body on a property that was privately owned. Given that Brandon was found on this private property, makes people think that the authorities are the most likely suspects. They would have been able to get their hands on the records of privately owned properties close by, dump him there, and then just conveniently not search that area, claiming that the owners did not give them permission. There is a possibility that this was a tiff between drug dealers or some gang-related quarrel, and that the second car that Brandon mentioned was actually not a state trooper at all, but that Brandon just mistook it for a police car. When I started this case, I genuinely thought that people were exaggerating the level of mystery here. With Brandon's history with drugs and his recent relapse, the chances of him wandering off in a paranoid haze just seemed more plausible, even if he hadn't used that day. Meth has a habit of screwing with the system for days after taking it. Especially with years' worth of abuse, it was the sheriff and his wife's actions that made me suspicious. Almost all of their claims are either completely fabricated or can't be proven. Yet Kyle's take on events can be proven. All of them. If the police weren't hiding something, then why go to all that trouble to obscure the truth? Look, I don't know what happened, what Brandon stumbled into, or what he truly saw. But I can safely say that he probably didn't die of exposure. Something happened to him, and somebody's been trying their hardest to cover it up. The name of this channel is Evidence Obscured, but ironically, we've never had a case where the evidence was more intentionally obscured by the very people that were supposed to solve this vanishing. Something went down in Coke County, and everyone in law enforcement and the papers tried to hide the truth. Like always, I encourage you to discuss this case in the comments below, because good gracious, we need new eyes on this. Maybe you have a theory that makes more sense than corrupt cops running after drug dealers in the woods. Don't forget to sub, to like, and to tune in for the next upload. See you in the next one, people.